French President Emmanuel Macron, as you might have noticed, is taking a prominent role in trying to mediate a peaceful resolution to current tensions between Russia and Ukraine. On Monday, Macron met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin before heading to Kyiv to meet with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Putin is refusing to rule out invading Ukraine and says Russia is working on a new written response to NATO and U.S. proposals. Ambassador Gérard Araud joins me now. He served as French ambassador to the United States from 2014 to 2019. Mr. Ambassador, it's great to have you with us. For Americans and for Europeans, what do you believe is at stake in this current crisis atmosphere, Russia and Ukraine?
I think that what President Macron was trying to do was simply to open a path towards de-escalation. You know, there are not only a Russian army on the Ukrainian borders, you have also Russian exercises, you know, in the Black Sea and in Belarus, and you have all these noises about a possible war. So what he tried to do was first de-escalation, and secondly, to have a process of negotiation. You know, for diplomats, it's always better to negotiate because when you negotiate, usually you don't invade. And that was the very, in a sense, modest goal of the visit of President Macron to Kiev and to Moscow.
And it was said by the French president that he was given personal assurances that Vladimir Putin has not made a decision about whether or not to invade. And in Kyiv, that was regarded as, well, personal assurances aren't nearly as good as actually pulling troops back and de-escalating. How do you evaluate that part of the conversation?
No, I think that the troops, the Russian troops, and it's really an instrument of blackmail. And I think to the very last day, to the very last moment, Putin, is not going to say that he's withdrawing his troops. And in a sense, I think he's the only person in Russia who knows whether he's going to invade or not to invade. It will depend on his assessment of what he is getting from the negotiation. So let's open a negotiation. And you may know that there is already a format of negotiation, which is called the Normandy format, with the Germans, the French, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. And this process, in a sense, has been stalling for some time. The people are going to meet again in 2 days. There is even thinking of having the head of state and government meeting together. So it's not being over-optimistic, but it's a positive result, at least. We are going to negotiate.
Mr. Ambassador, it's the perception here in the U.S. that Vladimir Putin is really making all the decisions, and even senior diplomats within his government don't have the final say. Based on your experience as a senior diplomat, what can you tell us about negotiating with Russians, and if in this particular case, maybe the foreign minister might not have as much sway in this particular matter as he might in others?
Oh, I'm totally convinced that Lavrov, the foreign minister, has absolutely no influence in the process, that he doesn't know whether Putin and when Putin will decide, as I was saying, either I invade or I claim victory because I consider that the concessions I got are enough. It happened to me, negotiating with the Russians, my counterpart was saying, okay, I agree. And the day after, he was obliged to call me saying, oh, Gérard, I'm really sorry, but the foreign ministry really didn't get the day at the Kremlin, and Putin refused the agreement. So again, there is only one person who matters, Vladimir Putin.
And I want to ask you about this other perception that is emerging both in Europe and here in the United States. Obviously, Angela Merkel was an enormously important voice, not only for Germany, but European politics. She has stepped aside. There is a new German chancellor just here at the White House very recently. But it appears that President Macron is stepping into, if not a de facto role of speaking for Europe, at least trying to move to the higher echelon of that, and possibly even for NATO as well. How would you evaluate that?
Well, the first Emmanuel Macron, when he went to Moscow, before going to Moscow, was in contact with President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, Chancellor Scholz, and actually a lot of European leaders, really. So what he has done has been done in coordination with the other Western leaders. And actually, after the meeting in Kiev, he went to Berlin to meet the Polish president and the German chancellor. So it's a coordinated effort. And it happens that Macron has two reasons to step in. First, France is the president of the Council of the European Union during the first 6 months of 2022. And secondly, as I've told you, there is this negotiation, the format of negotiation called Normandy, really with the Germans, with the Ukrainians and the Russians. So it was the two ways for Macron, I think, two reasons and two bases to step in.
Mr. Ambassador, you, of course, were in that position during the Trump administration. How would you compare the Trump administration and the Biden administration in general in terms of relations with Europe and European capitals, and in this particular atmosphere around the fate and the future of Ukraine?
No, first, I think there is, of course, a big difference between the two administrations because the Trump administration didn't care about allies and basically was taking its decision from the hip. And we were informed through the TV of what he had decided. And on the top of that, he was saying that actually NATO, the commitment of the US to Europe through the NATO treaty was not something that he was really very much excited with. While the Biden administration has reaffirmed, of course, the commitment of the US to NATO. But having said that, and it's a very important difference, nevertheless, I think we can, in Europe, we feel, and it's from Obama through Trump and now with Biden, that there is a shift in the US foreign policy from Europe towards Asia. And I do understand it. Really seen from the US, of course, the major interest of the American interest are now more in Asia than in Europe. And that's the reason why, in a sense, Macron is stepping in, working with the Americans, but also saying, well, we, the Europeans, we should be able to handle our affairs by ourselves and not be obliged to rush to Washington, D.C. as soon as there is a problem.
Mr. Ambassador, very quickly, it's been written that if, in fact, Russia were to invade, it would be a catastrophe, understandably, for Ukraine, but would also be a long-term catastrophe for Russia and Europe writ large. Do you agree?
Of course, really, because it will be a sort of a new Cold War between Russia and Europe. We will be obliged to impose sanctions, which will be very painful for the Russians, but also for the Europeans, because Europe has a trade 9 times more important than the US with Russia. So we will carry the burden also of the sanctions. And so it will be really, frankly, something that we really don't want. But last point, I think the Ukrainians are very surprisingly, the Ukrainians are much less worried than Washington, D.C. about the Russian invasion. It's very striking. Everybody who is meeting President Zelensky is struck by the fact that he's much more cool that the people in Washington, D.C. and all the Russians I know are telling me, no, we are not going to invade Ukraine. It's impossible to launch a war. But really, beyond the war, you can have a lot of small action, hacking and so on against Ukraine coming from Russia.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time and your perspective.
It's a pleasure.